Hey folks, my name is Ed from Brainpulp TV, and this is my deck tech for a little budget Pauper Infect brew I like to call the Infectious BGs. It's designed to make sure you're staying alive while you give your opponent night fever and... Okay, honestly, you know what? I can't do the whole music references thing in my deck tech deal. That's Travis's thing. Travis, by the way, who actually listens to music, while I had to Google the BGs just to find out 2 songs that they made. So, moving on, this deck tech is part of Brainpulp TV's Top Deck Hero $25 Pauper Challenge / giveaway, which, if you missed the video where we announced the challenge, you can click on the link appearing on screen right now and we'll take you to it. And trust me, it's worth checking out, because in it, you'll find out how, by leaving a single comment about Pauper, you could win a $25 store credit from TopDeckHero.com, where you can pick up any number of cards from their wide selection of Magic singles. Now, since this deck tech is part of our challenge, there were certain rules I had to follow when creating it. First, other than basic lands, the entire deck, including sideboards, can't cost more than $25 Canadian, which, as of this recording, is about $19 US. However, that doesn't include taxes or shipping, and for the sake of this challenge, we're basing all of our prices off of those listed at TopDeckHero.com. Beyond that, there are only 2 other stipulations. First, this deck cannot be the same or relatively similar to ones I've previously used in episodes of our Magic gameplay show, The Mana Cave. And as a personal torture to yours truly, the last rule is that I cannot use any blue cards in my deck. So now that I've gone over the rules, let's get back to those Infectious BGs I was talking about before. As you've probably already guessed by the name, this build is a black-green Infect deck. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Infect, it's a mechanic that first came out in Scars of Mirrodin. The basic idea is this. Creatures that have Infect don't do straight-up damage. Instead, when dealing the beats to other creatures, they dole out -1/-1 counters equal to what the normal damage amount would have been. And in the case of a player, instead of lowering life totals, they infect them with poison counters. Now, the great thing about poison counters, or the most frustrating and annoying thing about them depending on your point of view, is that once a player has 10 of them, they lose the game. So essentially, this means by playing an Infect deck, your opponent's life total is cut in half before you even begin. Now, there are several different kinds of Pauper Infect decks out there. Some are designed to get large creatures on the board and then give those creatures Infect with cards like, and God only knows if I'm pronouncing this right, Pheresis or Tainted Strike just before they swing in. I, however, will be going the route of trying to flood the battlefield with smaller, lower cost Infect creatures and then pumping them up to try to overrun my opponent. And when it comes to pumping up your creatures, while both green and red have more than their fair share of spells capable of doing just that, I felt green had both a wider selection of those types of spells as well as a larger stable of Infect creatures. Also, green is the king of trample effects, which can be amazing at allowing Infect damage to seep past blockers and into your opponent's bloodstream, and that's something I decided to focus on with this deck. As for why I chose black as my other color, well, like green, it has a nice selection of Infect creatures. Also though, while relatively low on pump spells, black does have a wide variety of other useful support spells to choose from. Plus, to be honest, flavor-wise, the swamp-filled power of black just felt right when it came to playing Infect. Now, let's get to the guts of the deck itself. First, allow me to introduce you to my little army of Outbreak monkeys. Well, okay, to be honest, none of them are actually monkeys, which would have been super cool, but you know what, never mind. We've got a playset of both Glistener Elf and Ichorclaw Myr, 3 copies each of Blight Mamba and Flensermite, and rounding things off, we have 2 pairs of pooches, Rotwolf and Corpse Cur. Let's take a closer look at each of them. Glistener Elf may not seem like much being just a 1/1, but as the only Infect creature with a CMC of just 1 that doesn't require any additional cost to activate Infect, it is a huge part of this deck. Being able to get the elf out on turn 1 means that with something like Vines of Vastwood, and I'll talk more about that card later, you'd have the potential of getting your opponent to 5 poison counters on turn 2. That means you could be halfway to victory before your opponent even plays their second land. The only other creature we have a playset of is Ichorclaw Myr. This critter is great for several reasons. First, it's not just a low-cost Infect creature. It's a low-cost Infect creature that can be cast for any type of mana. Color screw be damned, this guy is coming out on turn 2. Its biggest strength though is its +2/+2 it gets when blocked. This disincentivizes your opponents from blocking it, which then makes it the perfect target for a pump spell. And if they do block it, well, that's why a lot of the pump spells in this deck have trample. Moving on to the creatures we're running 3 of in this deck, we've got Blight Mamba and Flensermite. Blight Mamba's ability to regenerate for 1 and a green is obviously a huge benefit, especially mid to late game when you've got the disposable mana to hold up for it. The combo of regeneration and Infect makes it both a wonderful attacker and blocker, because not only will it survive an unfavorable combat situation, but those -1/-1 counters will start taking their toll on even the hardiest creature. Now, Flensermite is really more of a personal preference pick. It may not be the best Infect creature out there, but I do enjoy me some lifelink, especially since I'll be running some spells that will cost both mana and health to play. Also, keep in mind budget was a concern for me, so with Ichorclaw Myr, Glistener Elf, and Blight Mamba alone costing a total of $7.99 Canadian, which is almost a third of the deck's entire budget, I was keen to start enlisting a few cheaper creatures into my army. Speaking of cheaper creatures, much like Flensermite, the last 2 critters in this deck, Rotwolf and Corpse Cur, both cost just 17 cents each, which means running 2 each of these does less damage to my budget than 1 Glistener Elf. They are, however, a bit more costly when it comes to mana. Rotwolf costs 2 and a green, however its 2/2 body makes it a bit beefier than its lower cost cousins. Plus, as a true blue magic player who has had his regular deck building toys taken away from him, I'll take any extra potential card draw where I can get it. Corpse Cur mana cost of 4 makes it the highest casting cost spell in the entire main deck, and with a body no bigger than Rotwolf, I questioned even including it. However, the combination of not needing to hold up a specific type of mana to cast it, along with its great mid to late game ability to return any Infect creature from the graveyard to my hand, made it a welcome member of the BGs. That said, playing this deck, I'd most likely want to avoid seeing both Corpse Cur and Rotwolves in my opening hand, which is why I chose to only run 2 of each. In total, my creature base cost $9.18, which is about 40% of my overall budget, but I think it was well worth it. Unfortunately though, a bunch of 1/1s and 2/2s alone won't win the day with this deck, so to help them out, we need ways to buff them up. And to do that, I've chosen the following: 4 Vines of Vastwood, 3 Bonesplitter, and 2 each of Horned Helm, Sylvan Might, and Wildsize. Keep in mind, my top choice would have been Invigorate, a card, much like Cloud of Fairies, that I fell in love with instantly when I first saw it. But sadly, that card, much like Cloud of Fairies, is banned in Pauper. My second top choice for this deck would have been a playset of Rancor, but that would have blown through almost a third of my budget on just 4 cards. Granted, it is an amazing card for this deck, so if I wasn't on a budget, it would have been an auto-include. In fact, part of me thinks I should have still found room for it in this deck despite the budget, but only time will tell. Still, while budget is important, you also need to know when to splurge a bit. And in the case of this deck, the previously mentioned Vines of Vastwood is worth every penny. A playset of Vines will run us roughly half the cost that Rancor would, and while Vines may not have the insane staying power or trample effect that Rancor does, it does act as both a protection spell and, when kicked, a sizable buff to our creatures as well. And, as I talked about before, it will allow this deck to potentially infect our opponent for 5 as early as turn 2. Also, due to the way it's worded, you can even cast it, unkicked of course, on one of your opponent's creatures to lock them out of buffing it for an entire turn if the need arises. Another far cheaper yet still effective way of getting in for a good amount of poison on turn 2 is Bonesplitter. Running 3 in this deck will ensure we've got a good chance of having it in hand early on, and its cheap casting and equip costs make it easy to get both on the board and attached to your creatures quickly. Plus, as an equipment, it does have a similar kind of staying power that Rancor does, despite the fact that it lacks trample. However, if it's trample you want, trample you will get with 2 copies each of Horned Helm, Sylvan Might, and Wildsize. First, let's look at Horned Helm. It may not be the flashiest of equipment, but its low casting cost and equip cost, coupled with both a +1/+1 buff and trample, should make it a useful addition to the deck. Plus, the added bonus of being able to move the helm around at instant speed for 2 green could make for some life-saving plays once blockers or targets of spells have been declared. Sylvan Might is a nice instant 2 cost +2/+2 buff with trample, plus its flashback cost, while kind of high, does help in a potential late game situation. I also like to look at it as sort of a budgetary cheat, as being able to cast the same spell twice means we can save a bit from having to put a couple extra copies in the deck. Last and yes, probably least, we have Wildsize, which also gives +2/+2 and trample at instant speed. At 2 and a green, it splits the difference between Sylvan Might's regular and flashback casting cost. And while it itself doesn't have flashback, it does replace itself in your hand by allowing you to draw a card, which, once again, as a blue player who's been forced from his sapphire-tinted comfort zone, I really like any spell that allows me to draw cards. Now keep in mind, running pump spells with Trample was a personal choice, but not necessarily the right one. So if Trample isn't important to you, I think running a playset of Mutagenic Growth should be pretty much a given in this deck. Other good choices could be Giant Growth, or Titanic Growth, or Swell of... You know what? Just do a card search for the word Growth, and take your pick of any number of cheap but effective pump spells. Getting back to this deck though, all in all, the total cost of the deck's equipment and pump spells comes in at $6.86, bringing the running total so far to $16.04 Canadian. Now let's talk about the rest of the spells in this deck. We've got 3 Murder, and 2 each of Apostle's Blessing, Read the Bones, and Unearth. First up, we have the bluntly named Murder. I don't feel comfortable running decks without some sort of removal, and this is about as straightforward in both name and action as you can get. Sure, the double black part of the cost isn't ideal, but it's still only 3 to cast, unconditional, and instant speed, which is just about everything you could ask for in some straight up killing. Next, we have Apostle's Blessing. Granted, given our colors, it's guaranteed to cost us at least 2 life in this deck, but with removal being a big part of a lot of Pauper decks, I feel it's a small price to pay for instant speed protection from pretty much anything. Plus, it also has a chance of making one of our creatures unblockable for a turn, which, coupled with one of our pump spells, could mean a very early end for our opponent. And while we're talking about spells that will cost us a bit of life, let's look at Read the Bones. Any spell that can give me both scrying and card draw, especially in that order, is a welcome addition to any deck I'm building, because being able to find that needed land, or filter out those mid to late game unwanted lands, or better yet, draw into the right spell at the right time is super useful in my opinion. Plus, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, I miss my blue draw spells. And last but hopefully not least of our non-land cards is Unearth. Now, budget-wise, 2 copies of this card cost more than 2 copies of each of the last 3 cards combined. However, as mentioned before, I found removal to be fairly rampant in Pauper, so I think this spell's graveyard to battlefield effect could be a huge boon for us. Plus, since all of our main deck creatures, save for Corpse Cur, cost 3 or less, unless we experience some serious graveyard hate, there is little chance that this card will not be useful. And to be honest with you, if it wasn't for budget, I probably would have been running 4 in this deck. And speaking of budget, our support spells come in at a respectable $4.50, bringing the running total for this deck to $20.54 Canadian. Doesn't leave us much, but luckily our land base will cost us next to nothing. Aside from running 9 basic swamps and 9 basic forests, the only other land in this deck are single copies of the black and green cycle lands, Tranquil Thicket, and Barren Moor. Oddly enough though, my choice to stick mostly to basic lands had nothing to do with budget. It was all about pacing. I felt that bogging this deck down with a bunch of come into play tap lands like Jungle Hollow or Golgari Rot Farm, while great mana fixing, would only slow us down. Plus, since Murder is the only card being run with a double color cost, I just felt that fixing wasn't really needed. Am I wrong? Possibly, but that was the choice I made. So after you add in the 44 cents for the 2 cycle lands, you get a main deck total of $20.98 Canadian, leaving just over $4 to put together our 15 card sideboard. Speaking of which, here's what we've got for that sideboard. We've got 3 copies of Rend Flesh, and then 2 copies each of Blightwidow, Kitesail, I'm going to mess this one up, but Viridian Longbow, Fog, Ebony Charm, and Tranquility. Let's take a closer look. Rend Flesh can be used as a replacement for Murder when playing non-spirit decks, giving you the same effect but without requiring double black, or it can simply help add removal to the main deck should the need arise. Blightwidow, like Corpse Cur, is a bit high on the mana curve for this deck, but if flying creatures is what's troubling you, or if you just need a blocker with a bigger butt, this Infectious Spider might do the trick. Now, Kitesail might help when facing off against flyer-based attacks, but more likely, this equipment's ability to grant your creature flight, as well as a small buff, will be better put to use on your attackers. Or if you find yourself hard-pressed to attack by either land or air, equip your army with a Viridian Longbow and skip the need to attack altogether, because since the Longbow states, this creature deals 1 damage to target creature or player, the infect damage rule still applies when using it. The huge downside of this card, though, is that despite the fact it only costs 1 to cast, its equip cost is a whopping 3 mana. Next we have Fog, because sometimes you're just on the wrong end of an aggressive deck and or attack, and having a damage-free combat round can buy you that 1 extra round you need to either equalize or possibly win. Now, Ebony Charm is here for, among other things, a bit of graveyard hate. Granted, if straight up graveyard decimation is what you want, something like Nihil Spellbomb might be a better choice. Plus, that card also grants some card draw too, which appeals to me. But what I like about Ebony Charm was that it also gave you the choice of giving a creature fear for a turn, and when playing against non-black decks, this might help slip some much needed poison counters through. And last but not least, Tranquility. One of the only upsides of this deck not running any enchantments is that it completely frees you from caring about the health and welfare of those types of spells altogether. Why remove just one when you can wipe the whole damn board of them? Of course, that pick may also have a little bias to it, as it might have something to do with me losing several times in the past to enchantment-heavy Pauper decks, but still, I stand by my final sideboard choice. Some other possible choices for sideboard or even main deck cards not listed here could be Duress, or other good discard effects like Hymn to Turok, or if you prefer to try to force your opponent to sacrifice creatures, Diabolic Edict or Chainer's Edict are also some good cards to consider. At the end of the day though, sideboard cards a lot of the time are about personal choice and taste and should reflect the current meta of where you're playing. Hell, to a certain extent, the same could be even said for main deck cards too, so feel free to tweak any and all cards in this deck to make it your own. But in the case of this sideboard though, it is costing us $3.20, bringing the full and complete deck total to exactly $24.18 Canadian, a whopping 82 cents under our $25 budget. Now, while the real test of the Infectious BGs won't come till this Friday when I square off against Travis in the Mana Cave, I can honestly say I had a lot of fun building this deck, even if I did have to stick to a strict budget. In fact, don't be surprised if I do another video for a non-budget version of this deck sometime in the future. However, for now, that's it for my Infectious BGs deck tech. If you have any Infectious tips or advice for this deck that stick to its budget, or even non-budget cards that you could use to push this deck even further, please let me know that in the comments section below, as I'd love to hear it. You can also follow and contact us on Twitter at BrainPulpTV, or me directly on Twitter at Geek Tragedy. In the meantime though, take care everyone, and remember, no matter if you're playing with Infect cards or not, if you're gonna tap it, sleeve it and stay minty.